Oh, what up? Back on the checks and balances and the principles of our wonderful government. Now we go to the executive branch and the powers and the checks that they have on the other two branches. As you can see, it's a much shorter list, but some of these powers are quite important. Uh, One of the biggest ones, obviously, is the power of veto. The president, with one stroke of the pen, can veto a piece of legislation from Congress. The practical effect that that has on governing and passing public policy is the mere threat of a veto. And there certainly is interaction between the executive branch and Congress in regards to passing pieces of legislation. Congress is not going to waste their time working on the long process of passing a piece of legislation, which we'll get into in Unit 4, if they know that the president is going to threaten a veto. Um, this should lead to compromise. It should lead to increased discussions between the two branches of government. If the legislative branch, if Congress really wants to pass a piece of legislation, they will be in contact, usually with the chief of staff of the executive branch. The chief of staff is the liaison or link between the executive branch and the legislative branch. Sometimes the vice president will play that role, but that depends on the administration. In this administration, Joe Biden, I would say, plays a little bit less of a role in that regard. The vice president is the president of the Senate or leads the proceedings in the Senate in the event that there's a 50-50 tie on a piece of legislation and therefore would be the tie-breaking vote. This rarely happens. So please don't think that the vice president participates in floor debate every day in the Senate when they're in session. As a matter of fact, rarely is the vice president, if ever, in the Senate chambers when they are discussing a piece of legislation. Commander in Chief of the military, if we go back up here to the power of declare war, this is the power that is opposite that, meaning the framers weren't very specific when they said just what role as a commander you play in leading the military. Does that mean you can just send troops carte blanche whenever you want to? What has happened in the late 20th century and into this century, the 21st century, is presidents have used this power extensively and have sent troops into, I wouldn't say a war, although the media oftentimes refers to it as a war, the war in Iraq. There's never been a formal declaration that we're in a war with Iraq. Um, Again, Congress has to approve funding of the military and their excursions that they make overseas. But as commander in chief, this power has been expanded greatly by presidents since pretty much the middle or early 20th century. World War II is the last time we've had a formal declaration of war. So all of the military events, if you will, that we've had since have gone without a formal declaration. And the constitutional rationale that the president or the executive branch gives is their ability as commander in chief to send troops when necessary. Recess appointments. Recess, it means you're not in official business. Recess appointments, if Congress is not in session to approve a presidential appointment, i.e., the Senate, the president may appoint somebody. Congress is usually not in session about 1/3 of the year. They get various breaks throughout the year. In the summer, they get a long, extensive break. If someone steps down in the executive branch, the president may appoint someone to that position until Congress can get back into session. Emergency calling in the session of one or both houses of Congress, so they can call back, the president can call back Congress. Usually this is done to appropriate money or in times of distress. 9/11, Congress was not in session. You can guarantee they were called back into session to deal with that issue. Hurricane Katrina, Congress was called back into session by George W. Bush to get funding to help people in Louisiana and other states that were affected by that tragedy. The executive branch can force adjournment when both houses cannot agree on adjournment. That's really not that important. And one thing, the president's compensation cannot be diminished while in office. Checks on the judiciary. The big one is the power to appoint judges. The president can appoint judges to the different levels of the federal judiciary, which gives them great influence. Obviously, that's become more political in the 21st and 20th centuries, and the presidents have tried to appoint people who have the same basic political beliefs that they do. Now, we know that the Senate, who approves, will have to agree that these judges aren't too ideological. They're not too conservative if you're Republican, or they're not too liberal if you're Democratic. This process has become more political over the years, and you will have formal Senate hearings where they will question the judicial candidates, especially at the Supreme Court and Circuit Court levels, to make sure they're good selections. But the president can pretty much choose whoever he wants to the judiciary. The pardon power is the ability to let people out of prison who are in prison, usually for minor petty crimes or white collar crimes, which deal with money laundering, bribery, etc. It's often used at the end of a president's term, where they're not going to be criticized and it really doesn't matter because they're leaving office. These tend to be Barack Obama. Recently, I would say it was maybe this summer, let a lot of low-level federal criminals out who had minor drug possession charges. What you'll know, or what you'll learn, is that our federal laws used to be very, very strict. You got caught dealing a small amount of drugs, you might get 20 or 30 years. Obviously, we know that maybe that's not proportionate to the crime or the offense. Presidents have also used it to let their friends out. Bill Clinton's half-brother was in prison for, I believe, drunk driving, multiple drunk drivers, or maybe it was a petty drug crime. Last couple days of office, in the list of pardons was his half-brother. There's nothing that Congress or police or the judiciary can do. This is a check on the judiciary. So if judges are making bad decisions, it's a way for the executive branch to alleviate that. Checks on the executive, this is very, very rare, but it's in there. If the vice president and the cabinet think that the president is unable, they can just discharge his duties. To my knowledge, this has never occurred. The cabinet members and the vice president typically are very loyal to the president, so why in the world would they decide to, remove him from office? I really would have to look. I don't think that has ever occurred. When we get to the judicial branch, you'll see it's very short, but it has perhaps the greatest power of all, which is judicial review. As we know, that was established in Marbury versus Madison, the ability for 9 justices, and at the least 5, to overturn every single law on a subject in the land. So when you talk about their decision giving same-sex couples the right to marry this summer, it went against federal law, and it went against many, many state laws that said that marriage is defined as between a man and a woman. That's a huge power, and the judicial branch in the last 100 years has used that power extensively to strike down pieces of legislation at the federal level and at the state level. Seats are held on good behavior. Again, they can be impeached. It has been hundreds of years, maybe, since the Supreme Court justice has been impeached. Some of the circuit court and district court judges have been impeached. I would say probably about 30 in the history of the Constitution as it is. Again, compensation cannot be diminished. That's not important. Judicial review, they can overturn an executive order. So not a law that the legislative branch makes, but the executive makes. So that is a check on the executive branch. And finally, the Chief Justice can sit as president of the Senate during an impeachment if the vice president is being impeached. So the vice president serves as the president of the Senate during that normally, but in the event that the vice president's being impeached, the Chief Justice can sit. Again, this is not something so important. The judicial branch is really easy to remember, and it's this: judicial review. This is the closing of checks and balances. We will proceed to the second set of notes, and hopefully this is a little bit enjoyable for you. We know it really isn't, but thank you for listening. Peace.